My name is Lauren Vance. I'm 29 years old. Yesterday morning, I stood on my back porch while the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association handed me a laminated notice for a $500 daily rolling fine. He smiled, adjusted his designer sunglasses, and told me that my simple cedar garden shed violated Section 4 of the Neighborhood Architectural Covenant. He gave me 48 hours to tear it down. I didn't get angry. I didn't argue. I just walked inside, opened my laptop, and pulled up a certified copy of a 1924 historic county plot map that I had tracked down through the state archives. When you track the original coordinates of this valley back to the old logging rail lines, the neighborhood boundaries completely shift. My shed wasn't just compliant. The map proved that the legal boundary of my property extended exactly 42 feet past our current fence line, meaning I actually own the land that the association president's luxury saltwater infinity pool is currently built on. Before we get into the documents, the surveys, and the exact moment his empire turned into a legal crime scene, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are listening from right now. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 2024, to a gravel driveway in Blackwood County, and the day I realized that peace in the suburbs is an illusion bought with compliance. Growing up, I didn't understand property lines. My father was a land surveyor for the state forestry department, a man who spent 35 years carrying a heavy brass transit through the backcountry, tracking old iron stakes and witness trees. He used to tell me that human beings spend their whole lives drawing straight lines on a planet that is entirely curved. He'd come home from a week in the woods smelling of damp earth and pine resin, sit at our kitchen table, and show me how to read topographical markers. He taught me that the earth has a memory, and that human records are often just a loud cover story. When he died 2 years ago, he left me his field notebooks, his collection of antique brass compasses, and a deep, quiet respect for things that are level. I bought the house at 142 Birch Lane with the inheritance he left me. It was a modest, 3-bedroom ranch style built in the late 80s, back before developers started squeezing houses together like teeth in a crowded mouth. The best part of the property was the backyard. It was deep, bordered by a dense line of ancient white oaks that separated my land from the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate directly behind me. That estate belonged to Arthur Sterling. Arthur wasn't just my backyard neighbor. He was the founding president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. He was a retired corporate restructuring consultant who wore crisp white polo shirts, drove a pristine black luxury SUV, and treated the 300 homes in our subdivision like a company he was trying to downsize. Arthur valued uniformity above all else. In Whispering Pines, your mailbox had to be painted one of 3 authorized shades of slate gray. Your grass could not exceed 3.5 inches in height. Your trash cans could not be visible from the street for more than 4 hours on collection day. For my first 18 months in the neighborhood, I played the game. I kept my head down, ran my freelance botanical illustration business from the spare room, and paid my monthly dues on time. I was invisible. And in an association like ours, being invisible is the closest thing you can get to safety. The trouble started 3 weeks ago. My illustration work requires me to harvest, press, and dry dozens of regional plant samples. The spare room was overflowing with drying racks, mason jars of seed pods, and reams of heavy cotton paper. I needed a dedicated workspace. I didn't want anything grand. I drew up plans for an 8 by 10 foot traditional timber frame garden shed. It would be built out of rough-cut cedar, tucked quietly into the far back corner of my yard against the oak trees, completely out of sight from the main street. I spent 2 weekends digging the footings by hand, checking the level with my father's old spirit level, and mixing the concrete in a yellow wheelbarrow. I felt connected to him while I worked. Every joint I notched, every cedar board I nailed into place felt like a promise kept to the way he taught me to build things. On the 3rd Tuesday morning, I was nailing the final trim around the small paned window when the shadow fell across my workspace. I turned around. Arthur Sterling was standing on his side of the low chain-link fence that marked our current boundary. He had his phone out, the camera pointed directly at my hands. "Morning, Lauren," he said. His voice had that practiced, institutional warmth that car salesmen and politicians use when they are about to take something from you. "Morning, Arthur," I said, setting my hammer on the staging. "Just finishing up the casing. The cedar matches the trim on the back porch perfectly." Arthur didn't look at the casing. He didn't look at the craftsmanship. He looked at his screen. "Did you file an architectural variance request with the board before breaking ground on this structure?" My stomach dropped slightly, a familiar reaction for anyone who has ever dealt with a neighborhood despot. "It's under 100 square feet, Arthur. The county building codes don't require a permit for anything this size." "The county doesn't run Whispering Pines, Lauren. The association does." He tapped his screen, swiping through a digital copy of the bylaws. Section 4.2. Detached structures, including garden sheds, greenhouses, and playhouses, require a 60-day review period, an architectural blueprint submission, and a $250 processing fee. Unapproved structures are subject to immediate code enforcement. "Arthur, it's tucked away in the back corner," I said, walking toward the fence. "Nobody can see it from the road. It doesn't impact anyone's sightlines." "I can see it," he said. He pointed over his shoulder. Behind him, past a manicured lawn that looked like artificial turf, sat his newly completed luxury outdoor oasis. It was a massive, concrete-poured saltwater infinity pool, complete with a natural stone waterfall features and an outdoor kitchen pavilion. The stone edge of his pool deck sat barely 5 feet from the chain-link fence. "It ruins the aesthetic value of my modern view corridor. The board will be issuing a formal citation." "The board is just you, and 2 of your golfing partners, Arthur." He smiled, a small, cold movement of his lips that didn't affect his eyes. "That's how governance works in a private community, Lauren. I'll see you at the meeting Thursday night." He turned and walked back toward his pavilion, his pristine white sneakers leaving temporary impressions in his perfect grass. I stood there, holding my father's old steel hammer, looking at the cedar shed that had taken me 3 weeks of physical labor to raise. I felt a familiar heat rising in my throat, the sharp instinct to fight back that I had spent years learning to suppress. I went inside, washed my hands with orange pumice soap at the kitchen sink, and stared out the window. Arthur was already back on his patio, sipping something from a crystal glass, while 2 pool technicians in blue uniforms skimmed the surface of his water. The association meeting was held in the community center basement under the buzz of old fluorescent tubes. Arthur sat at a long folding table in the center of the room, flanked by Vice President Greg and Treasurer Wade. They looked less like community volunteers and more like a tribunal. There were maybe 12 other residents scattered in the folding chairs, most of them holding notices for minor infractions like unapproved flower bed borders or off-color curtains. When my name was called, I stood up and presented a folder. I had printed out the county guidelines, photographs of the shed's placement, and data showing that cedar was a sustainable, fire-resistant material that actually enhanced property aesthetics. I spoke calmly. I used my professional voice, the one I used when presenting technical illustrations to corporate publishers. Arthur didn't look at the folder. He didn't open it. He let it sit on the table between his elbows like a piece of junk mail. "The evidence is irrelevant, Ms. Vance," Arthur said, switching to my formal last name for the audience. "The rule is absolute. Whispering Pines is built on a foundation of uniform structural harmony. If we allow one unapproved cedar shed, we open the door to corrugated tin shacks, detached workshops, and systemic property devaluation. The board has voted unanimously to reject your retroactive variance application." "So what is the remedy, Arthur?" I asked. "You have 48 hours to remove the structure entirely," Treasurer Wade filled in, his voice flat and robotic. "Failure to comply will result in an immediate fine of $500 per day, placed as a rolling lien against your property title." A soft murmur moved through the residents behind me. $500 a day meant bankruptcy within 2 months for a single homeowner. It wasn't a regulation, it was an eviction strategy. "And if I request a formal appeal through the county court?" I asked. Arthur leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. The association contract you signed when you purchased this home explicitly waives your right to county arbitration on architectural disputes. We are a private entity. Our decisions are legally binding. Don't make this harder on yourself than it needs to be, Lauren. Tear it down. I looked at Greg. I looked at Wade. They both looked away, staring down at their legal pads. They were his crew. They had been voting his way since 2018, adjusting the neighborhood rules to fit whatever Arthur's personal preferences were. I picked up my folder from the table. My hands were perfectly steady. 48 hours, I said. Starting at midnight tonight, Arthur confirmed, checking his luxury gold watch. I walked out of the basement. The night air was crisp and smelled like damp asphalt. I drove home, parked my Subaru in the dark driveway, and walked directly into the backyard. The moon was high and bright, casting long, stark shadows through the branches of the white oak trees. The cedar shed stood square and silent in the corner, smelling faintly of sawdust and resin. It looked solid. It looked right. I went inside, walked into the spare room, and dragged my father's heavy green canvas field chest out from the bottom of the closet. The brass locks were tarnished, green with oxidation. I found the small iron key in my jewelry box, inserted it into the keyhole, and turned it until the latch popped with a heavy metallic clink. Inside were his field books, his leather-bound logs, and the hand-drawn survey maps from his 35 years working for the state. My father had always told me that counties make mistakes when they convert old rural land into modern suburbs. They rely on aerial photographs and developers' promises instead of walking the actual dirt. I pulled out a thick roll of blue parchment maps labeled * Blackwood County District 4. Historic boundaries, 1900–1940. I unrolled it across the floor, weighting the corners down with jars of dried seed pods. I found Birch Lane. In 1924, before the developers laid the asphalt, this entire valley was known as the Miller Timber Tract. The boundary line between the northern parcel, the land Arthur's house was now built on, and the southern parcel, my land, wasn't determined by a modern subdivision fence. It was anchored to a historic physical monument, an old iron railway stake driven into the base of a twin-trunk white oak tree. I grabbed my flashlight, my father's antique brass transit compass, and 100-foot steel measuring tape. I went out into the dark yard, my bare feet cold against the wet grass. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves of the oaks above me. I walked to the line of trees separating my yard from Arthur's. There were 6 massive oaks, but only one was a distinct twin-trunk specimen. It sat exactly 7 feet inside my current fence line. I knelt at the base of the twin trunk, clearing away 3 decades of rotting leaves, acorns, and damp topsoil with my bare fingers. My nails scraped against something hard and rusted. I dug deeper, my flashlight held between my teeth. 10 inches beneath the leaf mold, my fingers closed around a heavy, square-headed iron spike driven deep into the ancient root flare of the tree. It was the original 1924 surveyor's benchmark. I set up my father's transit compass directly over the spike. I leveled the brass base, sighted the needle due north, and locked the dial. Then, I hooked the end of the steel measuring tape to the iron spike and started walking backward, straight into Arthur Sterling's backyard. The tape unreeled with a long metallic hiss. I passed through my low chain-link fence. I walked past the line of young ornamental shrubs he had planted. I kept walking until the tape hit 42 feet. I stopped. The flashlight beam traveled down the length of the yellow steel tape. It ran straight up the pristine stone stairs of his patio, crossed his manicured lawn, and ended exactly halfway through the crystal blue water of his luxury infinity pool. According to the original 1924 deed coordinates, Arthur Sterling's fence line was 42 feet inside my property. His outdoor kitchen pavilion, his flagstone patio, and half of his $120,000 saltwater pool didn't belong to him. They belonged to me. I stood there in the dark, the wind blowing the scent of chlorine across my face, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I allowed myself to smile. It was 2:14 in the morning. The neighborhood around me was completely silent. Arthur's house was dark, his security lights sweeping his lawn at regular intervals, unaware that his entire backyard oasis was legally built on a foundation of stolen dirt. I rolled up the measuring tape, packed up the transit, and went inside. I sat at my desk until dawn, drafting a formal email to the state archivist and the county records clerk, requesting a certified copy of the original 1924 survey block chart. I included the file number from my father's notebook, 1924 MT084. Before I closed my laptop, I looked at the rolling fine notice Arthur had given me. 48 hours. The clock was ticking for both of us. He thought he was counting down the hours until my financial ruin. He didn't know that I was counting down the hours until his entire property asset unraveled in real time. The next 48 hours moved with the slow, agonizing precision of an impending storm. By Wednesday night, the state archivist had emailed me back with the certified, high-resolution digital scans of the 1924 Miller Timber tract plat map, stamped and verified by the county clerk's repository. I printed 3 physical copies on heavy, oversized ledger paper, the blue and white lines of the historic boundary crisp and clear. I stacked them on my kitchen table right next to the $500 daily rolling fine notice. Arthur Sterling didn't wait until Friday morning to enforce his timeline. At exactly 8:02 a.m. on Thursday, the sharp crunch of tires on gravel sounded outside my house. I looked out the kitchen window. Arthur's black luxury SUV was idling in the street, and Arthur himself was walking down my driveway, flanked by Wade, the association treasurer, and a man wearing a bright neon safety vest and a hard hat. The man in the vest was holding a digital clipboard and a can of industrial neon pink survey paint. I stepped out onto the back porch, my coffee mug in hand, the morning air damp and thick with low-hanging valley mist. "Time's up, Lauren," Arthur called out as he reached the edge of my porch stairs. He didn't take off his designer sunglasses. He tapped a laminated document in his hand. The 48-hour grace period for the voluntary removal of the non-compliant structure expired at midnight. As of 8 o'clock this morning, your property is officially in active violation of Section 4.2. "I see you brought company, Arthur," I said, keeping my voice level, rhythmic, and perfectly calm. "This is Mr. Vance from Blackwood Enforcement Services," Wade chimed in, stepping forward with his robotic corporate posture. "We are here to document the refusal to comply, mark the violation zone for the structural lien files, and officially initiate the $500 daily fine sequence. If the structure remains standing by Monday morning, the association will execute a summary forced demolition at your personal expense." The man in the safety vest looked slightly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting from Arthur to me. "I'm just here to verify the structural coordinates relative to the neighborhood parcel layout, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Go ahead and mark the shed boundary, Gary," Arthur ordered, waving his hand toward the back corner of my yard where the cedar shed stood. "Paint a clear perimeter line on the grass. We need it documented for the legal affidavit." "Gary," I said, my voice sharp enough to make the surveyor freeze mid-step, "before you shake that paint can, I highly recommend you take a look at something." Arthur sighed, a loud, theatrical sound of pure impatience. "Lauren, please. We are past the negotiation phase. You waived your right to administrative appeals when you bought into the covenant. The paperwork is finalized." "I'm not appealing to the association, Arthur," I said, walking down the porch steps with my folder of certified documents. "I'm looking at a matter of state property law. Gary, are you a licensed state surveyor? Or just a private contractor?" "Licensed, ma'am," Gary said, pulling off his work glove. 14 years with the state board." "Excellent." I opened the folder and pulled out the first oversized ledger sheet, sliding it directly over his digital clipboard. "Then you'll know exactly what this is. This is the certified 1924 Miller Timber tract plat map, file number 1924 MT084, pulled from the State Archive repository yesterday afternoon. And this," I handed him a smaller document, "is the original physical description from my property deed." Gary squinted, pulling his reading glasses down from the brim of his hard hat. His posture changed instantly. The casual, indifferent shrug of a contractor vanished, replaced by the rigid, focused attention of a professional who just looked down and realized he was standing on a live wire. Arthur snapped his sunglasses down to the bridge of his nose, his eyebrows drawing together. What is that junk? Lauren, historical maps have no bearing on modern master plan communities. The Whispering Pines parcel layout was finalized by the Development Corporation in 1986. The Development Corporation bought the land from the Miller estate, Arthur, I said, my voice deadpan. But they never ran a physical boundary survey of the northern tract flare. They relied on an aerial coordinate grid that didn't account for the historic benchmark. Gary, look at Block 4, Section 7. Gary's thumb traced a faded blue line on the paper. He looked up, his eyes wide, traveling toward the dense line of ancient white oak trees at the back of my yard. The twin-trunk oak, he whispered. The monument stake. Exactly, I said. The original 1924 benchmark spike is driven 10 inches deep into the root flare of that twin white oak tree right there, exactly 7 feet inside my current fence line. And according to the deed description, the northern boundary line runs exactly 42 feet asterisk north of that stake, on a strict 0-degree meridian alignment. Wade frowned, looking at Arthur's screen. 42 feet north, that would mean. That means, I cut him off, looking directly into Arthur's hidden eyes, that the legal property boundary doesn't stop at this chain-link fence. The fence was installed 42 feet south of the actual legal limit. My land extends nearly halfway into Arthur's backyard. The silence that fell over my driveway was absolute. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of a lawnmower 3 streets over and the idling engine of Arthur's luxury SUV. Arthur let out a short, hollow laugh, but it cracked down the center. This is a ridiculous, desperate bluff. Gary, tell her she's insane. Mark the shed. Gary didn't shake the paint can. He slowly set his digital clipboard down on the hood of Arthur's vehicle and pulled a heavy, yellow industrial GPS transit system from his utility belt. Arthur, hold on. If that historic spike is still in the root flare, and if the chain of title didn't explicitly carve out a parcel variance during the 1986 acquisition, she's not bluffing. What do you mean she's not bluffing? Arthur's voice finally lost its smooth, institutional polish. It went sharp, thin, and defensive. I have a title insurance policy. I built my pool based on the neighborhood plot map. Neighborhood plot maps don't supersede original county deed records if the legal descriptions were never amended, Gary said. He was already walking toward the back tree line, his heavy boots sinking into the wet grass. Let me cite the coordinates from the twin oak. Arthur and Wade followed him like men walking toward a gallows. I stayed by the porch stairs, holding my coffee, watching the machinery of Arthur's certainty fall apart brick by brick. Gary knelt at the base of the twin-trunk white oak tree. He pulled back the leaves I had cleared the night before, placed his GPS sensor directly against the exposed, rusted head of the 1924 iron spike, and waited for the satellite lock. The machine gave 3 quick, high-pitched electronic beeps. Gary stood up, looked down at his readout, and then turned his head toward Arthur's immaculate backyard. He walked straight up to the chain-link fence, pulled his steel tape measure out, and extended it over the wire. He didn't even need 42 feet to make his point. The yellow steel tape crossed the young shrubs, ran across Arthur's pristine lawn, and tapped against the heavy gray flagstone edge of his luxury pool deck at exactly 28 feet. The line cuts right through the center of the deep end, Arthur, Gary said, his voice flat, professional, and completely devoid of sympathy. Your entire pool pavilion, your outdoor brick kitchen, and roughly 20,000 gallons of your saltwater infinity pool are currently sitting on her dirt. Wade stepped back, his face turning the exact color of old printer paper. Oh, God. Arthur, the association approved your pool variance layout in 2022. You signed off on it as the board chairman. Shut up, Wade, Arthur hissed, his hands beginning to shake as he tucked his laminated fine notice into his pocket. He turned on his heel, glared at me through the fence wire, his face flushed a bright, angry crimson. This doesn't change anything, Lauren. Adverse possession. I've occupied this land, I've maintained it, I've paid taxes on the Whispering Pines parcel for 8 years. Adverse possession requires open, notorious, and hostile asterisk occupation without a mistake in the chain of title, Arthur, I said, leaning against my porch railing. But more importantly, Under Blackwood County Code Section 12.4, an association board member cannot claim adverse possession against a resident if they use their corporate position to validate their own property lines without an independent survey. It's called a breach of fiduciary duty. You signed your own approval forms. Arthur looked at Wade. Wade didn't look back. He was already checking his phone, his fingers typing furiously, likely looking for the association's liability insurance contact information. I'm not marking this shed, Arthur, Gary said, picking up his clipboard from the SUV. In fact, if I were you, I'd get my own legal counsel on the phone before noon, because according to the state board, you are currently maintaining a structural encroachment on private land. Gary got into his truck and backed out of my driveway without another word. Arthur stood at the edge of my grass for 3 long minutes, his chest rising and falling in heavy, ragged, shallow breaths. He didn't look like a corporate restructuring consultant anymore. He looked smaller, his white polo shirt wrinkled, his expensive sunglasses sliding down his nose in the humidity. This isn't over, Lauren, he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and dawning financial terror. I'll tie you up in county litigation for 5 years. You won't be able to sell a single drawing by the time I'm done with you. I don't need to sell drawings to pay for dirt I already own, Arthur, I said. You have 48 hours to review your options. Midnight Saturday. Let's see who's counting down the hours then. He turned and stormed back toward his SUV, the doors slamming hard enough to rattle the window panes in my spare room. Wade didn't get into the car with him. He walked down the street toward his own house, his head down, his legal pad clutched tight against his ribs. I walked out to the cedar garden shed. The woods smelled sweet, warm from the morning sun that was finally breaking through the valley fog. I picked up my hammer, positioned the final piece of trim around the window casing, and drove the nail home with 3 solid, level strokes. That afternoon, the real counterstrike began. I didn't file an association appeal. I drove downtown to the Blackwood County Courthouse, walked straight to the Registrar of Deeds, and filed a formal asterisk notice of encroachment and cloud on title asterisk against Arthur Sterling's residential parcel. It cost me $45 to file, and once it was stamped into the county database, it froze Arthur's ability to refinance his house, sell his land, or obtain a clean title report. When I got home at 4 o'clock, my phone was ringing. It was an unknown number with a local corporate area code. I answered it on the 3rd ring. Ms. Vance, my name is Richard Sterling, a voice said. It wasn't Arthur. The voice was older, heavier, and completely stripped of any neighborhood drama. I am Arthur's older brother, and I am the primary equity partner in Sterling Development Holdings. We need to talk about the property line on Birch Lane. Richard Sterling spoke with the blunt, heavy weight of an old-school developer who knew exactly how much a mistake costs when the foundation is already poured. He told me that Arthur had called him in a panic 2 hours ago. My brother is an idiot, Ms. Vance, Richard said plainly. He let his ego run a neighborhood association, and now he's compromised a $1.2 million residential asset over a garden shed. I've seen the 1924 plat map scans Gary forwarded to the enforcement office. The coordinate lines are airtight. You own the dirt. I know I do, Mr. Sterling, I said, sitting at my kitchen table, looking out at the oak trees. We are prepared to offer you a cash settlement, Richard continued, his pen scratching against paper on the other end of the line. $40,000 directly from our holding company to execute a clean quitclaim deed for those 42 feet, redrawing the boundary along the current fence line. You keep your shed, the association fines are dropped permanently, and we settle this out of court. $40,000 was more than my botanical illustration business made in an entire year. It was a life-changing amount of money for a single woman living in a modest ranch-style house. It would have paid off my car, updated my roof, and expanded my studio space inside the house. It was a rational, practical, generous offer. But I looked down at the table, at the laminated daily fine notice Arthur had handed me with that smug, superior smile, and I thought about what he had said to the residents in that basement. Whispering Pines is built on a foundation of uniform structural harmony. If we allow one unapproved cedar shed, we open the door to ruin. The 42 feet are not for sale, Mr. Sterling, I said. A long, heavy silence stretched across the phone line. The only sound was the low hiss of the connection. Ms. Vance, be reasonable, Richard said, his tone dropping into a dangerous, colder register. If you refuse to sign, my brother will have no choice but to file a structural variance lawsuit through the circuit court. It will tie up your property title for 18 months. You won't be able to refine your home or do a single thing with that yard. Your brother gave me 48 hours to tear down my father's work over a code that didn't exist, I said, my voice steady, clear, and uncompromising. I'm simply applying his own logic to his backyard oasis. The encroachment notice stays on the title. Tell Arthur I'll see him on the grass Saturday at midnight. I hung up the phone. My heart was pounding against my ribs, hot and fast, but my hands were cold and perfectly still. I went into the backyard, sat on the steps of my cedar shed, and watched the sun dip below the oak trees, casting long, dark shadows straight across Arthur's blue saltwater pool. The water looked beautiful in the twilight, clear and deep, but it didn't belong to him. And by tomorrow morning, the entire neighborhood would know exactly who owned the ground beneath it. By Friday afternoon, the suburban ecosystem of Whispering Pines had completely fractured. In a master-planned community, rumors travel faster than the automated lawn sprinklers can cycle. Wade, the association treasurer, had spent the morning calling the remaining 4 board members to notify them that the HOA's general liability insurance policy explicitly excluded coverage for property line disputes caused by unapproved board encroachments. By 3:00 p.m., 2 of the board members had already emailed their formal resignations to Arthur, citing a desire to distance themselves from his personal legal liabilities. I spent the day in my studio, finishing a series of intricate ink drawings of Quercus alba asterisk, the white oak trees that guarded my property line. I drew each leaf with absolute precision, the sharp, deliberate lines of the pen matching the quiet focus that had settled into my bones. At 5:30 p.m., a knock sounded at my front door. I opened it to find a woman in her early 40s wearing standard medical scrubs, her face drawn with exhaustion. It was Clara Vance, a nurse who lived 3 doors down at 148 Birch Lane. She had a rolled-up piece of neon yellow cardstock clutched in her right hand. "Lauren," she said, her voice tight, "Arthur issued me a $200 fine yesterday because my daughter left her toy bicycle on our front lawn for 3 hours after school. He told me if I didn't pay it by Monday, he'd place a lien on my house. Is it true? What Gary the surveyor said at the mailbox this morning?" "If it's about the property line, Clara, yes," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Arthur's pool is 42 feet inside my legal boundary." Clara looked down at the yellow cardstock fine in her hand, then slowly ripped it in half, her shoulders dropping as a ragged breath escaped her lips. "He's been terrorizing this street since 2018. He made the Miller family tear down their handicap ramp because the wood stain didn't match his approved palette. If you take that pool down, Lauren, I'll help you carry the concrete." "I don't think I'll need to carry any concrete, Clara," I said. "The dirt is doing the work for me." By Saturday morning, the neighborhood had turned into a silent spectator gallery. Residents who usually kept their garage doors shut and their heads down were suddenly finding reasons to walk their dogs past 142 Birch Lane. They walked slowly, their eyes tracking the yellow steel measuring tape that still lay across my backyard grass, running straight underneath the chain-link fence and ending at the gray flagstone edge of Arthur's luxury pool. Arthur's house was completely dark. His black luxury SUV sat in the driveway, but the pristine white polo shirts and the designer sunglasses were nowhere to be seen. The only sign of life on his parcel was the automated pool filtration system, which hissed and hummed at regular intervals, pumping salt water through 20,000 gallons of water that was currently resting on my inheritance. At 7:00 p.m., 5 hours before my Saturday midnight deadline, Arthur's brother Richard called back. This time, his voice didn't carry the cold, corporate weight of a developer trying to close a negotiation. He sounded tired, his breath heavy through the receiver. "Ms. Vance," Richard said, I've spent the last 6 hours reviewing the 1986 master deed with our corporate title attorneys. My brother didn't just fail to run a physical boundary survey. He actively modified the plat map coordinates in the association's digital filing system back in 2022 to make his pool application look compliant to the county zoning board. That's not a variance error, Ms. Vance. That's administrative fraud. I figured it was something like that, Mr. Sterling, I said, sitting at my desk with my father's survey log open in front of me. My father always told me that when a line is that crooked, someone had to hold the ruler down with both thumbs. If this hits the county circuit court, the holding company's title insurance policy will flag his entire parcel as a toxic asset, Richard said, his pen tapping a frantic rhythm against his desk. The bank will call his mortgage. He'll lose the house, the land, and my development firm will be named as a co-defendant for backing his architectural variance. Name your price, Lauren. We will triple the original cash offer. $120,000. Right now. You sign the quitclaim deed, and we redraw the line at the fence. I looked out the window. The twilight was fading into a deep, velvety indigo night. The cedar garden shed stood square and clean in the corner, its fresh wood gleaming softly in the rising moonlight. $120,000 would have bought me a completely new life. It was a fortune for a freelance botanical illustrator. But I looked down at the original 1924 blue parchment map, at my father's elegant, slanted handwriting in the margin. The ground doesn't lie. Human beings just try to build over the truth when they think nobody is measuring. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice calm, rhythmic, and perfectly level. Your brother spent 8 years telling this neighborhood that codes are absolute, that boundaries cannot be crossed, and that compliance is the only measure of a resident's worth. I'm simply enforcing his own standard. The 42 feet stay under my title. I'll be in the backyard at midnight. I hung up before he could respond. At 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the deadline, I walked out onto my back porch. The valley air was dead silent, thick with the scent of pine resin and the clean, ozone smell that comes before a midnight dew. The moon was a sharp, brilliant silver crescent directly above the white oak trees, casting stark, knife-like shadows across the grass. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't bring a police officer. I carried only my father's antique brass transit compass and a heavy iron sledgehammer I had inherited from his forestry toolbox. When I reached the chain-link fence, I stopped. Arthur Sterling was already standing on his side of the wire. He wasn't wearing his designer sunglasses or his white polo shirt. He was in a faded gray sweatshirt and jeans. His silver hair uncombed, his face looking hollow and gray under the pale moonlight. He was holding a flashlight in one hand and a thick stack of legal documents in the other. Behind him, through the glass patio doors of his darkened house, I could see Wade sitting at the kitchen island, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glare of a laptop screen. The association was running out of time. Lauren, Arthur said. His voice didn't have any institutional warmth left. It was gravelly, thin, and desperate. The board has formally rescinded your $500 daily rolling fine. We've entered a permanent, retroactive architectural variance into your property file. Your shed is fully compliant. The lien sequence is dropped. That's a very generous gesture, Arthur, I said, setting the head of the heavy iron sledgehammer down against the grass. But the shed was always compliant. The county codes verified that 3 weeks ago. We aren't here to discuss my shed anymore. We are here to discuss your pool. Arthur flinched, his flashlight beam wavering across my boots. My brother offered you $120,000. That's double what this entire backyard is worth on an open appraisal market. Why are you doing this? Is it just revenge? Sibling jealousy over a development asset? It's not revenge, Arthur, I said, looking past him to the crystal blue water of his infinity pool, which gleamed like oil in the moonlight. It's architecture. You spent 8 years treating this neighborhood like a company you were trying to liquidate, carving up people's lives to fit your own personal view corridor. You told me on Tuesday that if I couldn't sacrifice for your uniform structural harmony, I didn't belong here. I'm just applying your logic to your own foundation. You can't touch this pool, Lauren, he whispered, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer to the wire. The structure is reinforced concrete. It's tied into the county water main grid. If you attempt to damage it, I'll have the sheriff's department here for criminal mischief within 10 minutes. I'm not going to touch your concrete, Arthur, I said, pulling the certified copy of the 1924 plat map from my jacket and sliding it through a gap in the chain-link fence. But the county registrar stamped my notice of encroachment at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. As of midnight tonight, your title is officially flagged as a legal hazard. The county water board has already issued an administrative freeze on your pool line usage until an independent civil engineering assessment can verify that your drainage system isn't discharging chemical runoff onto my land. Arthur looked down at the map clutched in his hand. Through the fence, I could hear Wade open the patio door behind him, his voice calling out from the shadows of the outdoor kitchen pavilion. Arthur, Wade called, his corporate tone completely broken. The county zoning clerk just sent an automated citation notice to the board email. They're fining the association $750 a day for maintaining an unpermitted commercial-grade excavation over a registered historic utility tract. The liability runs straight to our personal assets because we signed the waiver. Arthur didn't look back at Wade. He didn't answer his crew. He just stared at the blue parchment map in his hand, his fingers crushing the heavy paper until his knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. The clock on my phone vibrated against my hip. Midnight. The 48-hour deadline had officially expired. I picked up the heavy iron sledgehammer, my hands perfectly warm, my grip solid and level on the worn hickory handle. I didn't swing it at his pool deck. I brought it down with one massive, echoing strike against the base of the metal fence post that marked his unapproved boundary line. The steel wire groaned, a sharp, metallic shriek that echoed off his concrete pavilion and ran straight across the quiet suburban valley. 42 feet, Arthur, I said, the echo of the strike still vibrating through the wet ground beneath our feet. Starting tomorrow morning, the fence comes down, the oak trees stay where they are, and your luxury outdoor oasis is officially classified as a private legal trespass. Let's see how your view corridor looks when I start planting my regional botanical samples directly inside your deep end. Arthur stood there in the dark, the flashlight beam dying in his hand as the batteries gave out, leaving him standing in the cold, unyielding silver light of the crescent moon. He had nothing left to say. The architecture of his certainty had completely collapsed, and for the first time in 8 years, the founding president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had absolutely nothing left to decree. The aftermath of that midnight confrontation unfolded with the shattering inevitability of a massive landslide. By Sunday morning, the news of Arthur Sterling's structural trespass had spread far beyond the borders of Whispering Pines. The local Blackwood County paper picked up the story, running a front-page article titled "Suburban Grid Warfare." HOA president's luxury pool sitting on neighbors' stolen land. The public exposure was swift, devastating, and entirely absolute. At 9:00 a.m. on Monday, a massive flatbed truck from Blackwood Engineering Services backed into my driveway, its heavy tires tearing up the damp gravel. Gary, the licensed state surveyor, stepped out of the cab carrying a heavy mechanical bundle of fluorescent yellow wooden stakes, a fresh spool of wire, and an updated digital alignment rig. Behind him came 3 crew workers carrying concrete post-hole diggers and a commercial wire cutter. I stood on my back porch, my arms crossed, my gray sweater pulled tight against a cold, snapping northern breeze that was driving the last remnants of the morning valley mist through the oak trees. "Morning, Lauren," Gary called out, lifting his safety visor as he walked toward the boundary line. He didn't have his digital clipboard out today. He had an official court-certified mandate from the Blackwood County Zoning Commission stamped and signed at 8:00 a.m. sharp. "We are here to formally execute the boundary correction for the verified 1924 Miller Timber Tract coordinates. The county sheriff's department has already cleared the structural parcel workspace." "Go ahead, Gary," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Make it level." The crew didn't waste a single motion. Within 20 minutes, the sharp, rhythmic snap of industrial wire cutters echoed through the quiet valley as they severed Arthur's chain-link fence from its anchors. They pulled the metal mesh down board by board, post by post, tossing the rusted framework onto the flatbed like scrap metal. Then, Gary positioned his digital alignment transit directly over the 1924 iron spike driven deep into the root flare of the twin-trunk white oak tree. He sighted his alignment dial exactly 42 feet north on a perfect, 0-degree meridian line. One of his workers stepped across Arthur's manicured lawn, walking straight up his pristine stone patio stairs, and slammed a heavy, pointed neon yellow wooden stake deep into the turf exactly 3 inches from the edge of his brick outdoor kitchen pavilion. The second stake went down right through the center of his luxury flagstone pool deck, splintering the expensive custom stonework into a spiderweb of gray cracks. The third and final stake was driven straight through the soft plastic liner of his saltwater pool's shallow-end steps. The structural puncture was immediate. I watched as a small, steady geyser of chlorinated blue water bubbled up around the yellow wood, cascading down his pristine stone steps and soaking into the stolen dirt below. Arthur Sterling stood on his back patio behind his floor-to-ceiling glass doors, watching his entire backyard oasis turn into a heavily staked construction zone. He didn't come outside. He didn't yell. He didn't wave his laminated bylaws or call his golfing partners on the phone. His phone was likely ringing off the hook already. The association's general board had called an emergency closed-door meeting for 2:00 p.m., and Wade had already spent the morning cooperative filing a civil affidavit that shifted all financial accountability for the modified plat map coordinates onto Arthur's personal restructuring consulting firm. By Tuesday afternoon, the shocking twist in the financial data was formally delivered to my mailbox by a private courier. It was a certified disclosure report from the Blackwood County Auditor's Office, initiated during the title search process. When Arthur had illegally modified the neighborhood plot map coordinates in the digital database back in 2022 to clear his pool layout. He hadn't just committed administrative fraud against the county zoning board. He had inadvertently miscalculated the total acreage square footage of his own parcel description for his primary mortgage lender. Because his luxury pool, patio pavilion, and stone kitchen were legally built on my land, his actual true property asset value was exactly 40% less than what he had declared to the bank during his 2023 home equity refinancing loan sequence. The moment my asterisk notice of encroachment and cloud on title hit the county registry, the automated compliance algorithm at Blackwood Regional Bank flagged his loan as a severe high-risk default asset. The bank didn't wait for a long, drawn-out 5-year circuit court trial. At 4:00 p.m. on Wednesday, a formal asterisk notice of accelerated foreclosure and loan recall was posted directly on Arthur's front door by a county processor. He had exactly 30 days to either pay off the remaining $420,000 balance in cash or hand over the keys to the residential title. Arthur's entire suburban empire, built brick by brick on a foundation of uniform compliance and administrative deception, had completely vanished in less than a week. He didn't have the cash. His brother Richard's development holding company formally severed all equity partnerships with him by Friday morning to insulate their own commercial real estate assets from the fallout. 1 month later, the final resolution was executed under a warm, golden late summer sun. Arthur's house was vacant, his black luxury SUV gone from the driveway, his immaculate lawn already growing wild and uncombed, the grass rising past the association-mandated 3.5 inches. The bank had taken formal possession of the house, but they couldn't touch the backyard. The 42 feet remained fully and uncompromisingly under my title. I stood on the edge of my new property line, holding a heavy burlap sack of regional wild plant samples and an antique wooden seed driller that had belonged to my father. Clara Vance from down the street was standing beside me, along with 3 other neighbors who had spent years paying Arthur's arbitrary fines for minor landscaping infractions. They weren't carrying architectural manuals. They were holding gardening spades, rakes, and bags of native wildflower soil. "Where do we start, Lauren?" Clara asked, her face bright with a genuine, relaxed smile that had been missing from this street for nearly a decade. "Right here," I said, pointing to the deep end of the drained, empty concrete shell of Arthur's former infinity pool. The water had been pumped out by the county drainage board, leaving nothing but a massive, hollow concrete crater in the middle of the grass. The soil underneath this concrete is old timber-tracked dirt. It's perfect for a deep-root botanical preserve. We spent the afternoon breaking down the outdoor kitchen pavilion board by board, using the salvaged cedar planks to build a series of expansive, terraced raised garden beds straight across his old flagstone patio. We filled the empty shell of his pool with organic topsoil, composting materials, and dense layers of native river gravel, transforming his modern view corridor into a thriving, sustainable micro-wetland for regional plant research. My cedar garden shed stood square, level, and solid in its corner, its natural wood grain catching the long, warm amber light of the setting sun. It didn't look like a code violation. It looked like an anchor. It was the structure that had held the ground down when everything else in this valley was sliding into compliance. I walked back up to my porch as the evening shadows began to lengthen across the white oak trees. I sat on the top step, my father's old spirit level resting across my knees, its green liquid vial perfectly centered, the tiny black lines holding the bubble in absolute, unmovable balance. If you are watching this and you see yourself in my story, if you are currently sitting inside a room where someone with a laminated clipboard and a superior smile is trying to tell you that your work isn't uniform enough, that your life doesn't fit into their approved palette, or that your boundaries are an embarrassment to their system, I want to tell you something. The ground doesn't lie. Human records are just a loud cover story, and it doesn't matter how much concrete they pour over your inheritance or how many daily fines they try to stack against your name. The truth has a patient, quiet way of showing up exactly when it's needed most. You don't need to shout to win a fight with a neighborhood despot. You just need to hold the tape measure down, sight the needle due north, and let the dirt do the work for you. Arthur Sterling thought he was drawing a straight line through my financial ruin. He didn't know that I was building a preserve on his foundation. That's not revenge. That's architecture.